Windows XP. If you used computers in the 2000s, then that name, these sounds, and this scenery probably conjure up a rush of nostalgic memories. Launched 25 years ago this year, XP was an operating system like no other. If you're a millennial or Gen Zer who cares about tech, there's a decent chance you grew up or started out in life with XP's friendly blues and greens. But there's more to this iconic version of Windows than just pure nostalgia, so in this video we're going to get into how XP became XP, the storied legacy of the OS, and whether it really was as good as many of us remember. Let's jump in. In the late 90s, Microsoft had a problem. Windows 95 and 98 had been phenomenal successes, minting a mountain of Microsoft millionaires and dominating the PC market. But the foundations were creaky. The consumer branch of Windows was still based on the crusty old MS-DOS from the 1980s. If you ever saw one of these glaring back at you from your CRT monitor, chances are DOS was in some way to blame. Meanwhile, Microsoft had the professional-focused Windows NT, which was more stable and powerful, but also far less compatible, especially when it came to games and peripherals. Windows was split between those two worlds, and it was pretty clear going into the new millennium that Microsoft needed something with the compatibility and user-friendliness of 98 and the stability of NT. Windows 2000 was the first step on that journey. It was based on Windows NT, not DOS, and was a leap forward in making NT usable by normal people on normal PCs, with proper plug-and-play support and DirectX 7 out of the box. However, it was also way more expensive and never really targeted at mainstream consumers. Instead, they'd get Windows Me. Yeah, enough about that for now. Windows Me obviously was a technological dead end. Instead, the next consumer release was codenamed Whistler, named after a Canadian ski resort that was popular with Microsoft bigwigs. Whistler grew out of Microsoft combining two earlier NT-based projects called Neptune and Odyssey that aren't really super important in our story. The point is, the future of Windows would be united for the 21st century on the new Windows codename Whistler that eventually became Windows XP. A lot of the technical underpinnings that made XP such a great OS already existed in Windows 2000. It was fast, stable, and ready for the future. Problem was, it still looked and acted like the Windows of the past. What was missing was a new UI for the 21st century, one that was less daunting and built around making it easier to get the stuff that you, as an early 2000s human with a personal computer, needed to get done. That new UI was known as Luna, a look which straddled the Y2K design trend at the time, with a few hints of what would eventually come to be known as Frutiger Aero. Microsoft went through a lot of research and false starts before the public got their first look at the new Windows UI. Early beta versions of Windows Whistler that shipped in 2000 included decoy themes like Watercolor, which was more of a continuation of the old Win9x design language, and Mallard, which was an intentionally ugly design intended to help engineers play around with Microsoft's new theming engine, but without giving the game away in terms of the final XP look and feel. XP's classic bright blue, green, and orange interface and shiny reimagined icons were brought to life through the work of two outside design agencies. Frog Design handled vast swathes of the XP UI, things like the taskbar, the double panel start menu, as well as branding for the OS itself. A lot of that work can still be seen in the portfolio page of designer Casey Potter, who worked for Frog at the time, back when the name was expected to be Windows 2002. There are also some fascinating concept drawings preserved by Marcus Kwan, including early media player designs and surprisingly skeuomorphic origins for the new taskbar and start button, with rubber and steel elements shown here. And Icon Factory was hired to overhaul Windows' array of iconography, eventually leading to over 100 of these highly recognizable graphics being produced over the course of 4 months. These bright, angled 3D icons were a breath of fresh air to replace the flatter, more corporate-looking visuals from the 9X era. The end product, assembled by Microsoft's design team, was an interface with softer edges, glowy hover-over effects, richer text, plentiful gradients, and welcoming full-screen visuals. Though you could argue it was an overcorrection from the grey, stuffy Windows of the 90s, there's no denying Luna made Windows more approachable and eye-catching. Fisher-Price? Well, maybe, but no one could call Luna boring. And if the default blue and green felt too much like a toy, there were 2 additional XP skins to bring more subdued silver or olive hues to your desktop. Switching to XP Silver, along with an accompanyingly gaudy wallpaper, was one of the first things any self-respecting mid-2000s gamer would do on a new XP install. Nice. Obviously though, Windows didn't exist in a bubble. All of this new design work was, in part, a reaction to the arrival of Mac OS X in 2000. OS X signaled that Apple, now with co-founder Steve Jobs back at the helm, was putting software design and user experience back at the heart of the Mac. So with higher res, high color graphics now going mainstream, and the competition shipping lickable icons and window chrome, Luna was a necessary visual overhaul for Windows. The most obvious thing many people focus on in beta builds of XP or Windows Whistler are the various placeholder themes in these pre-release versions, one of which was a direct rip-off of Apple's Aqua that looks like it was intended more of a proof of concept than anything that was seriously being considered. But there are other interesting features in leaked Whistler builds that were ditched long before XP went public. One of the many leaked beta builds includes this optional full-screen start page. You can see how this eventually morphed into the final XP start menu because it basically includes the same functionality, just spread across the entire screen. Discovered by Twitter user Albacore in 2020, it's a unique look at how a full-screen start interface was imagined long before the days of Windows 8. Later builds saw this evolve into something like an extension of the active desktop feature introduced in Windows 98, where a full-screen web page could become your desktop. Also sort of similar to the activity centers that were being sketched out for inclusion in Windows Me and Windows Neptune before being abandoned and then revisited much later in the form of Windows 8's hubs. Some real early aughts web design vibes coming from both of these. You can almost picture someone knocking this thing together in Dreamweaver back in the day. It was certainly a far cry in hindsight from the polished, glowy, colourful interface that Luna turned into. In the end, Microsoft's obsession with making everything look like the web fizzled, as evidenced by XP's new welcome screen, full-screen login pages, and the eventual start menu design. The new Windows visuals were successfully kept under wraps until January of 2001, when Bill Gates demoed Whistler at CES in Las Vegas. The Windows portion of that demo is actually considered lost media at this point, which really surprised me given its historical significance. But Japanese publication PC Watch has some stills that show off a few early differences never seen in any leaked build of XP. The rightmost panel of the start menu has this softer gradient, while the font and shading on the start button is different, and the button itself also has the old Windows flag from the 9X era. A month later, at a different event, the new name was confirmed. The future of Windows wasn't 2001 or 2002 or any other year. Windows XP stood for Windows Experience. A bit of a tortured abbreviation there, but it signaled a clean break with the nomenclature of the past. XP's improvements weren't just skin deep though. As further beta builds made their way out to the public, testers got to grips with new features like the redesigned Explorer with better support for images and video. Built-in CD burning and camera support arrived at a time when sharing your own multimedia creations was just about becoming feasible on a home PC. New LCD panels shipping with top-of-the-line machines could benefit from clear-type anti-aliasing, and if you used a lot of apps, then taskbar grouping could help you keep the bottom of your screen clutter-free by organizing windows into stacks. The icing on the cake came in the form of a soundscape created by composer Bill Brown, with ambient chimes and harsh dings that remain deeply ingrained in popular memory even today. All this stuff and more justified the extra year of dev time after Windows 2000. In fact, looking back now, it's kind of amazing this whole project with its iconic look and vast feature set came together in what, by modern development standards, is a pretty short amount of time. Buttons and panels aside, XP wouldn't be XP without the instantly recognizable Bliss wallpaper, the background against which the friendly new 21st century operating system was framed. Bliss was taken by photographer Charles O'Rear in 1996 in Northern California and was eventually sold to Microsoft for an amount widely estimated to be in the low six-figure range. Not too shabby. YouTuber Michael MJD has an excellent deep dive on this photo and the man behind it, which I'd highly recommend. We'll link in the description. But the Cliff Notes version is that O'Rear just happened to be driving through Sonoma County when he passed this disused vineyard in the aftermath of a rainstorm, capturing the scene's vibrant blues and greens on Fujifilm Velvia film with a Mamiya RZ67 camera. That image just happened to end up in the possession of a stock photo company owned by Bill Gates, and the rest is history. Today, the location of Bliss is back to being a working vineyard, and more recent recreations somehow lack the magic of the original. The only indication that you've reached the site of one of the most viewed photos in history is a marker on Google Maps and a tiny roadside sign. Windows XP was released to manufacturing on August 24, 2001, 2 months before the scheduled retail launch. Overall, by Microsoft standards, the XP dev cycle was fairly smooth, avoiding a lot of the drama that plagued Windows Vista's development later in the 2000s. Many technical gremlins had already been ironed out in the process of shipping Windows 2000. Instead, what minor controversy there was surrounded the ongoing antitrust suits facing Microsoft, with some US senators demanding a delay to XP's launch while the monopoly concerns were addressed. Regardless, Windows XP launched right on schedule at a gathering in New York City on October 25, 2001. The event itself now serves as a surreal viewport back into a very specific moment in American history. This was just 6 weeks after 9/11, and if you're old enough to remember how things were in the immediate aftermath of those attacks, then you'll know how important it was that this event in this city went ahead as planned. This was a more serious affair all round than Microsoft's last big software shindig, which was led by Jay Leno in 1995, balancing an important milestone for Microsoft against the national mood of the moment. It's still a weird historical juxtaposition, though, to see this bright, hopeful software debuting against the backdrop of the event that's seen as marking the end of the optimistic post-Cold War period and the beginning of the more turbulent times that we're still living in. Nevertheless, the show went on. Regis Philbin brought additional star power to the XP launch.
Bill Gates, what does the XP in Windows XP stand for?
While Sting performed a free concert in Manhattan to cap off the festivities. XP TV ads were set to Madonna's Ray of Light, showing the futuristic digital cyber world you could inhabit with your webcam wrangling, music mixing, video editing XP PC. What a time to be alive. We can't include the original copyrighted music for obvious reasons, so here's a fitting royalty-free alternative. If Windows 95 and 98 were about what the PC could bring to your home, then XP was about what it could help you do out in the world in this new connected century. True to its original promise, XP had the stability of Windows NT, but was more friendly and approachable than Windows 2000, and with much improved compatibility to boot. Reviews from the tech press at the time were mainly positive. This was the first consumer version of Windows built on genuinely solid foundations, having cast off the shackles of MS-DOS.
It's a much more stable operating system. If you've been using Windows 95 or 98, it really does, it crashes less.
Now sure, XP's heavier graphical interface and extra background processors demanded a beefier PC, mainly in terms of RAM versus what you could get away with on Windows 98 or 2000, but the minimum spec for a decent XP experience, 128 to 256 megabytes, wasn't exactly uncommon at the time. Of course, that didn't quell the righteous indignation on some forums and user groups.
Do not touch Windows XP. It is way slower than WinMe and Win98. It's 1.8 GB hard disk.
Windows product activation was another new pain point that many a nerd would comment on online. Unlike earlier versions, XP needed to be activated with a product key over the internet or via phone call to Microsoft in order to be used long term. The logic behind this was pretty obvious. High-speed internet and CD burners made piracy much less of a challenge than it had been just a few years earlier. So to run XP for more than 30 days, you'd need to check in with the mothership, and to a lot of power users, that felt like an imposition. YouTuber and former engineer Dave Plummer, who worked on XP, has an interesting video going through how he went about building the activation experience if you want a deeper dive. Again, we'll link it down below. Product activation inevitably led to a cat and mouse game between Microsoft and hackers attempting to reverse engineer the system to run illicit XP installs without paying for a key. The biggest hole in this security, though, was of Microsoft's own making. See, retail keys needed online activation, but corporate volume licenses didn't. That led to one infamous XP product key starting FCKGW leaking out online in the weeks before launch. FCKGW was one of those corporate volume keys, which by design sidestepped the online activation when used with the right installation disk. Oof. That wasn't the last example of Microsoft dropping the ball around XP security though, because in the months following launch, the OS was hit almost immediately by a spate of vulnerabilities and malware threats. In December 2001, news broke of the first major security vulnerability in Windows XP, and it was a doozy. The flaw in Universal Plug and Play allowed XP machines to be remotely compromised over the internet, a huge security hole in the new OS. Online security flaws might be a dime a dozen in the 2020s, but they were new and scary in the early 2000s, and thus big news at the time. Other high-profile bugs followed going into 2003, including the notorious Blaster Worm that could quickly compromise XP systems across networks, leading to Microsoft playing whack-a-mole in its attempts to deal with all the different Blaster variants. For a company supposedly putting trustworthy computing at the core of its products, it wasn't a good look. All of which led to Microsoft redeploying engineers who had been working on the next version of Windows after XP back to put out security fires on the OS they had just shipped. This did eventually result in a much more stable and secure Windows XP with the release of Service Pack 2 in mid-2004, but not before Microsoft had burned through a lot of user goodwill and dealt with more than a few critical headlines. Alright, so the first couple of years of Windows XP weren't exactly smooth sailing, but if you ask anyone today, chances are that's not at all what they remember about this OS. The average person is more likely to recall through their rose-tinted glasses of nostalgia the friendly blue and green companion that first got them online, helped them crank out homework assignments, and get stuck into some classic PC games, or perhaps accompanied them taking their first steps in the working world and got them up and running on their first office laptop. Windows XP was Microsoft's main OS for home users and professionals for more than half a decade, thanks in part to the fraught and protracted development cycle of its successor, Windows Vista. But Vista's woes in parts were actually due to XP's security issues in its early years. So serious was this XP security crisis that much of Microsoft's top talent had to be moved from the Vista project to help fix up XP. And by the time Vista did eventually ship, following a midway development reset where a lot of early work had to be junked entirely, XP was entering its 6th year of service looking better than ever. Throughout that time, its system requirements obviously stayed the same, pretty modest by mid-old standards, while the software itself only became more polished and reliable through successive service packs and fixes from Microsoft's most capable engineers. By the end of 2004, many of XP's security issues had been addressed. New features like Bluetooth support and improved Wi-Fi brought it up to date with the latest peripherals, and PC hardware had advanced to the point where even a real crap box could run it flawlessly. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Windows Vista remained in development hell. XP matured more gracefully than any Microsoft OS before or since, and by the time Vista launched, that successor with higher requirements seemed bloated and clunky by comparison. Perhaps not surprising then that XP downgrades for new PCs became so popular around that time. Windows XP sold more than 17 million units in its first couple of months. There's no hard figure available for lifetime installs, but estimates range somewhere around the $500 million mark. It took until 2012 for XP to finally be overtaken in market share by Windows 7 as the most used version of the OS. More than a decade after Microsoft discontinued official support in 2014, XP stubbornly continues to live on. Embedded systems like ATMs, vending machines, and ticket kiosks count themselves among the small slice of systems still running XP. Some branches of the US military even continue to use it through long-term custom support agreements with Microsoft. XP stuck around so long and matured so gracefully largely by accident. But as a result, so many of us so-called digital natives have fond memories of growing up using this bright, bouncy interface with its soothing tones and orchestral chimes. Whether it really was the best version of Windows is open to interpretation. It had bugs, security issues, and its design definitely veered a little too much into Teletubbies territory than I would have liked. But as the OS that conjures up the most fond adolescent memories for people like me, Windows XP is in a class of its own. That's it for now. Share your memories of Windows XP down in the comments if you used the OS, and let's face it, you made it to the end of this video, so chances are you did. Stick around and subscribe for more deep dive retrospectives like this, and if you had fun here today, then be sure to check out our mini documentaries on Windows 95, Windows Vista, Windows 8, and Windows Phone. But for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.